Hello there and welcome to this Pyroseminar where we're going to look at the Peterson-Zizek debate that's happening in Toronto. What I'm doing is we're going to do this over two. This is just going to be a very short introduction. If you're watching this live, then you're probably going to be watching the Zizek-Peterson debate that's going to be happening in a few hours' time in Toronto through the live stream. So I'll just do kind of a basic introduction to the two thinkers, where they agree, where they disagree. And then tomorrow night, I'm going to do a more extensive seminar where I'll just basically do a bit of a commentary on what happened. And I'm very excited about this. I said in the description that this is probably the most talked about or most controversial kind of academic talk since Chomsky sat down with Foucault in the 1970s. Now, there's a little bit of hyperbole there, but in another sense, it is very hard to think of another time where there's been so much interest in an academic talk. Peterson is more of a popularist, which is, I'm not saying that in a bad way, I'm a popularist. Zizek is a popularist, but he's also a philosopher. But people are buying tickets for $1,000 a pop. They're downloading it like this is a Conor McGregor fight. So there'll be tens of thousands of people. I'd be fascinated to know the figures actually, but people who will be watching this on the live stream as well as being there in person. In fact, Peterson wanted to bring this on the road and wanted to do this in dozens of cities, but Zizek wasn't keen. Zizek wanted to do this once for a very particular reason, which I might talk about in a second, because he mentioned it in a recent podcast where he talked about what he wants to get out of this debate. So anyway, it is a massive thing. I'm excited about it. I'm interested to see what happens. I'm nervous. This is what it feels like for people who are into football or who are into wrestling or boxing or anything like that. I've never been into those things, so I don't know what it feels like. But this, I get it now because I'm excited and nervous and I'm interested in what's going to happen. It could be a massive disappointment, could be absolutely fantastic. Who knows? So we're having drinks here. We're going to be eating together, and as I say, at 12:30 at night, the kickoff will happen. So I'm not going to explain who they are. You probably already know a little bit about them. You can look up Wikipedia. I'm also really bad at all of the autobiographical stuff or the biographical stuff. That's an interesting Freudian slip. I'm also very bad at autobiographical stuff. I don't remember very much about my own life. It kind of bores me. So other people's personal idiosyncratic things also bore me, but I can tell you the basics. Jordan Peterson's Canadian, he's a clinical psychologist and he has a Jungian bent. So let's say three things about him. One is he's trained as a clinical psychologist, not as a psychoanalyst, clinical psychologist. So he has an interest in the scientific study of the subject. And so a lot of his work, he is referencing contemporary research that's being done that's trying to find basically what science does is it finds regularities, it finds connections, it finds causality. You're studying hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people to try to find insightful data. So he's in that frame. That's quite different, by the way, from a psychoanalytic approach, which is very singular. The idea is that everybody's a type of universe. And so although you can chart various things that people have in common, psychoanalysis is very interested in the idiosyncratic, the particular, the thing that makes you who you are in all your weirdness. And you are very weird. I've gone through your trash, right? So Peterson, clinical psychologist, he's also conservative, I would say. Now, I don't mean that in a pejorative way. Peterson doesn't use the term, but when I say conservative, I just mean that he tends towards wanting to conserve or return to something in the past. And particularly, you'll notice in a lot of his lectures, say on religion, he is thinking that Western civilization is under threat of being destabilized by various forces, cultural Marxism being the main one. That this is an external threat that is threatening to undermine various Western institutions that I think most of us would agree are, even if they're not perfect, not bad. You know, the justice system, education system, health system, etc., etc. So even when you listen to him talk about religion, a lot of it is saying that we need to return to these stories. We need to return to these myths because they teach us something that we have lost. In fact, this is one of the differences he has with some of the other people who are called the intellectual dark web. Because, and this is interesting. I mean, for a while, there was a move on the right that was mostly new atheist. And what Peterson has brought in is something interesting there, because he's within that frame, very closely connected with people like Sam Harris, Dennett and Hitchens and Dawkins. You could put Peterson in broadly that field, but with a big difference, which is he really wants to reconnect with religious mythology. In fact, he has taught more probably on the Bible than anything else. I mean, there's a whole, I listened to them all, and there must be 30 hours of lectures that he has online that are a close reading of the beginning of the Hebrew scriptures. So it's very, very important for him to return to something that we have lost. And ultimately, it's a return to the collective unconscious for Peterson. So that's the second thing. There's a conservative dimension to him, which is a desire to conserve certain institutions, a desire to conserve certain religious mythologies and stories, and to return to them, to let them restore balance to a threatened imbalance that is occurring today. And then thirdly, and very connected to that, is Peterson has a very Jungian approach to his thinking. So in terms of the primary thinker, and I've listened to a lot of Peterson, and he mentions a variety of thinkers. And some of the thinkers he mentions, I've got to be honest, even though he says he's very influenced by them, I think that he's quite different from them. But the one who I think he is closest to, and that he understands best, and that he works with a lot, is Carl Jung. Now, that's not to say that all Jungians are sympathetic to Peterson. I've talked to some Jungians who aren't sympathetic, but in my reflection and reading Jung and listening to Peterson, I would say that actually he has a very strong connection with the Jungian understanding of the unconscious and of the subject, and that influences his notion of politics, his desire for a more conservative worldview, his fear of a destabilization of the West, his talk about yin and yang, or masculine, feminine, order and chaos, light and shadow, that need to be brought together in a type of harmony. So there you go. There's three elements just in terms of Peterson. One, he's trained as a clinical psychologist, so scientific psychology. He has a conservative bent, which is a desire to conserve religious stories, religious mythologies, to connect us with the collective unconscious, and to protect us from a threatened destabilization from things like cultural Marxism or feminism or various identity politics positions. And then thirdly, he is very Jungian in his approach. And when I mention Jung, I mean primarily Jung's notion of the unconscious. So for Jung, the unconscious is, it's almost a subconscious, not an unconscious, and there's an important difference there. A subconscious is the idea that there is something beneath our consciousness, that we push things down. And for Jung, the unconscious is beneath the conscious, and it really is there to try to restabilize the individual. So if, for example, right, a very basic example, as a kid, if you're thirsty, you might dream of drinking water, right? So what's happening in your body is you are very, very thirsty. You're really wanting to quench that thirst. And so the dream is an attempt to bring homeostasis back into your life. Or if you need to go to the toilet, you'll dream about going to the toilet, right? Again, you're dying to go to the toilet, and so the dream kind of, in a sense, tries to answer that desire in some way. And in adulthood, perhaps, as an example, you really despise someone, you really look down on someone, but then maybe you're unconscious, you will dream of them in some sort of important way. They will have an important role in your dream. And it's almost like an attempt to get a better perspective of that person. You're not thinking of them highly enough. And so the unconscious comes in with the opposite in order to bring balance and harmony. So there's I think it's the volume 7 of Jung's collected works. There's 2 essays that deal with Jung's notion of the unconscious, and they're very influential in Peterson's work. So that's Peterson. Zizek is a first-rate philosopher, a continental philosopher, who has a number of influences. His 3 main influences are Hegel, the philosopher Hegel, and I think that's his main influence. And he said that himself, that as he gets older, again, like Hegel is the kind of the rock upon which he is smashed, right? And upon which everyone's smashed. Like, he is the high point of the philosophical tradition for Zizek. And there's some truth to that. I think Hegel is that high point of philosophy, and it's hard to do philosophy without taking Hegel seriously. So he's a Hegelian. He's also a Lacanian. So the other great thinker that is influencing Zizek's work is Lacan. And to a lesser extent, he's also a Marxist. He's into Marx. And the 3 of those figures, Marx, Lacan, and Hegel, are in conversation with each other. So much so that Zizek is creating something that is, in a sense, an innovation. Because, and Zizek talks about this, but innovation happens in philosophy often through not just being faithful to a thinker. So you're faithful to Hegel, you read him very carefully, you think it through, but then crashing him against somebody else, and then reading him through that lens, and misreading him. And basically, Zizek has taken these 3 thinkers. There's a variety of other thinkers that are deeply important to him, but those 3 thinkers are kind of brought into conversation in a way in which they illuminate aspects of each other that might otherwise go unnoticed. And Zizek has written a phenomenal amount of books. I mean, over 50 books. It could be over 100. It's like so many. He's prolific. Although he gets the critique that often he's writing the same book because he repeats stories and analogies. What you'll notice if you're a careful reader of Zizek is, yes, he'll use the same stories, but he will often shine a different light on them. And actually, that's very important for Zizek. He says, like, instead of jumping around from one analogy to another, he prefers to get one that's really meaty, just like a painting. You get a painting that is really beautiful. You don't just look at it once and then go on to another painting. You put that painting in your house if you can, or a print of it, and you go back to it again and again, and you look at it in different ways, and it speaks to you in different ways. And for Zizek, that's why he uses a lot of the same analogies, because he finds that the ones he picks are very rich, and he'll look at them in various ways. But he has written probably 6 or more books that you could say are seminal works in various areas. He's made significant contributions in philosophy, particularly in his work on Hegel. He's made significant contributions in the area of political philosophy, particularly with his work on ideology and desire. And he's made significant contributions to the world of theology, using Lacan to revitalize radical theology. And I need to talk to some psychoanalysts, but I think he may have also made significant contributions to psychoanalytic theory. But if not, he is definitely one of the leading expounders of Lacan's thinking in a philosophical way. And so that's Zizek. And these are two giants in different ways. They are people who command a huge audience. They have a huge amount of influence. But there's another reason why this debate's interesting. It's because there are a number of areas where they meet. Right? There's three subjects, three areas that they're both interested in, but in very different ways. So I'm just going to mention what they are. The first is that they are interested in Christianity. Right? They are both deeply interested in the religion in general and Christianity in particular. Secondly, they are both interested in the unconscious, very interested in the unconscious, and they are both very interested in critiquing progressive politics. Right? So those are the three areas where they kind of combine. They are very interested in Christianity. They are very interested in the unconscious, and they're very critical of progressive politics, liberal politics, and neoliberalism. So I'll just take each one of those in turn. Christianity. Okay, both of them have spent a significant amount of time on theology. One of Zizek's most famous books, perhaps his best, is the Sublime Object of Ideology. And in the Sublime Object of Ideology, he is already doing theological work. There's, theology isn't mentioned explicitly very much, but there are a number of places in that book where you start to see his interest in Christianity, particularly through the lens of Hegel. But he then, later on in his career, writes a number of books that are specifically around Christianity. They are, I should have looked at this in advance, but they're On Belief, which is a very short book. Supposedly he wrote it in a week. And it's a messy book, but full of really interesting insights. So On Belief. There's The Puppet and the Dwarf, which is a brilliant reading of Paul. And there is, so let's see, On Belief, The Puppet and the Dwarf, and I forget the third book that he did on, like this very specifically theological. It'll come back to me. But in addition to those three, the third that I forget is also The Monstrosity of Christ, which is a book that is half written by John Milbank and half written by Slavoj Zizek. So there is this period where he was writing about that consistently and speaking about it consistently. Now the difference between the two of them is that The Fragile Absolute. There you go. The third is The Fragile Absolute, another fantastic book. The difference is Peterson has a Jungian approach to Christianity. So what he sees is the Bible as an ancient text, wisdom text, that has rules for life, that tells us how we can live in continuity with the universe, that we can find a harmony and balance within ourselves. We can reconnect with all of humanity through the wisdom of these stories. So he reads the Bible. I mean, you could say this is maybe sounds pejorative, but kind of as a self-help manual. Now, that doesn't mean that he thinks it's only a self-help manual. I don't think he does. Actually, although he doesn't talk about it very much, like he's not doing apologetics. He's not arguing for the existence of God. You won't hear Peterson, talk about the 5 ways of Aquinas, or argue for the existence of God through the ontological argument or anything like that. If anything, it seems that, and I'm just through what I've listened, it seems like Peterson is saying that his argument for the existence of God, if he has one, is more connected to the idea that this narrative is so profound and so deep and so in tune with reality itself, that it seems like something that is transcendent. So his argument is more of an argument like who else makes that type of argument? Um, I have to think about that, but it is a type of argument that says, the Bible has such great insight into what it is to be when we mine it, that it couldn't be anything else. Actually, in Islam, this is one of the arguments for the Quran. If you ever talk to someone who's on the street, who's Muslim, who's talking to people about their religion, you'll find that they'll sometimes read some of the Quran and the argument is, this is so beautiful and it's so beautifully constructed and it was written by someone who wasn't educated, that is kind of evidence of its transcendent source. But that's not important to Peterson. What's important to Peterson is he feels that as a society we need to reconnect with these ancient stories in order to create defenses against the destabilizing force of an external enemy that is threatening to basically bring chaos at the expense of order. As an aside, by the way, people often say that Peterson's all about tidy your room. I think that's one of his pieces of advice, tidy your room. But Peterson himself has said, because when I heard that, I was like, that's a bit weird, because if you're an obsessive, that's the last thing you should do, because obsessives are so tidy that their houses are like graveyards. It's like the Apple aesthetic, right? So for an obsessive, saying tidy your room doesn't do anything. You're going to be like, no, you have to tolerate a bit of messiness, right? But I think Peterson would agree with that. He just thinks that chaos is reigning, and so we have to go to the other extreme. But he's wanting to find this balance. And a Jungian reading of the Bible is it gives self-help. It's about how to live. It's about how to find a balance with yourself, with society, with your neighbour, with the ground of being. In contrast, Zizek is saying something very different. Zizek is a more existential reading of the text, much more Kierkegaardian. Zizek is arguing that the Bible is not a self-help book. In fact, it's the opposite. It's madness. From the point of view of wisdom and self-help, the Bible is crazy. Like Abraham and Isaac, the story of God dying, and all the various stories. Job, like Kierkegaard would say, like the one thing you shouldn't say about Jesus was he was moral or he was ethical, because in a sense, when you read the biblical text, it critiques our notions of wisdom and it critiques our notions of morality. Christ is a stumbling block to those who want to treat it as wisdom, and was a stumbling block to those who want to treat it as a type of self-help, and a foolishness to those who want to treat it as a wisdom tradition, right? It doesn't fit in that way. And instead, Zizek is trying to argue that Christianity brings us into confrontation with antagonism and with the absurd. So it's much more in the tradition of, say, Kierkegaard or Camus and others. And so it's much more Freudian and Lacanian. Zizek is kind of saying that's why he makes such a big deal of Christ saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which is this experience of the rupture of God. He's saying that Christianity is drawing us into some sort of place where we have to do business with the lack and with the antagonism, turn it into something good, but we can't get harmony and balance. There is an imbalance that we have to harness in a positive way. Is there anything else I could say about that? I mean, there's so much in this. I don't want to defend or attack either position. I'm just kind of outlining them. For Peterson, the Bible is more of a connect with the collective unconscious, connect with this wisdom tradition, this ethical tradition that brings harmony and stability into our lives. For Zizek, Christianity is drawing us into an ability to confront the antagonisms of life, doubt, complexity, ambiguity, and to find a way to mobilize that. To say it in a very, very philosophical way, for Peterson, God fills the ontological, the lack that is in life. God kind of brings harmony and fullness and plenitude. But for Zizek, God is the name we give to the lack. God is the ontological lack. God is a name we give to a type of revelation of rupture in reality. So you've got two very different ways of approaching Christianity, but both of them vie for it. Both of them are calling themselves Christians. Both of them use that term. Both of them are happy to use that term in a world where a lot of people would be embarrassed to use the term theologian or the term Christian. Both of them are laying claim to that, and that's really interesting. But they have very different readings of that. The second thing I mentioned was the unconscious. Both of them are interested in that dimension. However, again, they go in very different ways. For Peterson, the unconscious is something that brings balance to consciousness. There is this kind of like, we're like a seesaw, or like one of those, I always forget the name of them, but I've got one that's one of those devices that always tries to find balance. You can set it off to one side and it will find equilibrium again. And they're a kaleidoscope. Oh no, it's not a kaleidoscope. I don't know. They've got them in planes, spacecrafts, all of that. Can't believe I can't remember the name. I had one as a kid. You put a piece of string around it, you pull a piece of string and it just spins, right? So the unconscious is like, there's the conscious and the unconscious. There is chaos and there is order. There is light and there is darkness. There is masculine and there is feminine. And these need to be in conversation with each other. And the less we are in connection with our unconscious, the more skewed we are. So for example, if we're very rational and we don't access our emotional life, that will cause all sorts of problems. Or if we're incredibly emotional and we don't think rationally hardly at all, again, that's very damaging. And what you have is your unconscious will be attempting to bring back the dimension that you are neglecting. But if you don't make peace with that part of yourself, it will come back in an aggressive way. And then, but then for Zizek, sorry, there's just at least someone is upstairs and they're creaking. I hope you can't hear it. For Zizek, the unconscious, he's Freudian. The unconscious doesn't exist. It's not like there's the conscious and there's the unconscious. All there is consciousness and then the rupture. The consciousness is not at one with itself, and it's the not at oneness with itself that is the unconscious. So an example I've used before, but simply in Northern Ireland, there's a city that is called Derry and Londonderry. It's got two names, and depending on what name you call it, it tells you about what your political position is. It tells you a little bit about how you see the world, how you see Catholics or Protestants. And there's no way to objectively name the city. You either call it Derry, and then you're within a nationalist community, or you call it Londonderry, and you're within a loyalist community. And that's kind of similar to the human subject. Basically, if you think about it, like there was a journalist who tried to solve this problem, and he started calling the city Stroke City, because journalists would say Derry stroke Londonderry, and so this guy started saying Stroke City, and he named the gap between Derry and Londonderry. But there isn't two cities. There's just one city, but that's not at one with itself. One city that different people see in different ways. And that's kind of like consciousness. There's the conscious and the unconscious, but the unconscious is the stroke. It is the slash that means it's not at one with itself. And that's very important, because what that means is that there is no balance. So within a Jungian position, we are trying to find balance. Within the Freudian position, there is just an inherent imbalance to reality. And in biology, that's called evolution. So an antagonism within physical species that causes all of this different things that we see today that are alive today. In science, it's in physics, it's superpositioning. In mathematics, it's the undecidability or uncertainty principle of Gödel. It manifests itself in a lot of different ways, but basically the Freudian notion is we shouldn't try to find some sort of balance. That's actually the problem. We always are seeking balance. We're always seeking a way to get rid of the lack, to get rid of the antagonisms of life. We always are tempted to fantasize some object that will fulfill us, make us whole and complete. But within the Freudian kind of view of the unconscious, it's like, no, you have to make peace with that antagonism. You need to harness it and utilize it in a positive way. So that's where they differ in the terms of the unconscious. And then the third area that I mentioned is in their critique of progressive politics. We're thinking primarily of student politics within the US. And again, they have very different reasons for being critical. And this brings us to the debate, because my guess is this is what they'll be talking about tonight, right? Basically, for Peterson, the increasing issues in terms of deplatforming of speakers and the less civility in politics, more hysteria, all of the stuff that we're seeing within kind of student bodies is a problem. For Peterson, that is an external problem that has entered into the American academy basically from the continent, primarily from like the Frankfurt School, where Marxism, and this is in Peterson's reading, Marxism became a uncredible position in the aftermath of Stalin. And so a variety of thinkers who were Marxist and who didn't want to give up Marxism, they then started to apply Marx to the cultural realm, to the reading of literature, to institutions, to movies. And this is what is called within, for someone like Peterson, is called cultural Marxism. And then this position basically took the notion of the proletariat as being oppressed by the bourgeoisie to the idea that there is oppressors and oppressed. And it's happening everywhere, in literature, in movies, in all sorts of ways. And that notion has infiltrated the US and is threatening to destabilize the good systems that are in place. And he would be the first to admit they're not perfect, but he thinks that this is a great threat. On that, by the way, that's not really what Marxism is not something that postulates an oppressive person and oppressor. That existed well before Marxism. There's lots of, all through the history of human development, there have been oppressors and the oppressed. Marxism is primarily a critique of a certain form of economics, capitalism, but that's beside the point. But for Peterson, the progressive politics that we see, identity politics, is a external problem that threatens to destabilize the West. Whereas for Zizek, it is a symptom. And the difference between a problem and a symptom is basically that a problem is something external that threatens to destabilize, whereas a symptom is the concrete manifestation of a destabilized reality that already exists. So to use an example, a friend of mine, who was a clinical psychologist, was working with a child who was wetting the bed. And the parents brought the child in and said, this is a problem, right? This bedwetting is becoming an issue. And it was threatening to destabilize the family unit. But as this person began to talk to the child, they realized that the bedwetting was not an external problem that was threatening to destabilize the family unit. It was the concrete manifestation of a destabilized, disavowed problem that was already existing within the family. In other words, the bedwetting was a type of truth. It was speaking something that was not being spoken of. And so for Zizek, this is not some sort of conspiracy, some sort of external force that is that is being imposed within America. Rather, it is the concrete manifestation of real political problems, of real oppression, of real issues that need to be addressed. And so what Zizek will be doing in this debate primarily is he will be using it as a way of saying, if you agree with Peterson that there are a variety of problems in terms of the civility of political discourse, the loss of a universalist political vision, etc., then you don't have to see it as a problem that is threatening to destabilize capitalism. He's going to say you can see it as a symptom that describes a catastrophe that is already within capitalism. The catastrophe isn't coming, it's already here. Right? The end of the world isn't in the future. We are living in the end times. And we are just ignoring the catastrophe, like being on the Titanic as it sinks, but drinking champagne. And that is where this debate is going to be interesting. Who is going to be more convincing? Is Zizek going to be able to draw people towards a non-identity politics left position? Or will he be unconvincing? And will Peterson be able to maintain the critique of ID politics, which he has, which has kind of made him famous? So there you go. That is the debate in a nutshell. That's my guess. If I was putting money on this, I'd say that's where it's going to be fought out. As far as I know, each of them will just be speaking for 30 minutes. They're not going to have an actual debate. They're going to speak for 30 minutes separately. I think a 10-minute response time and then Q&A from the audience. So with that, I'm going to leave you to it. Hopefully you'll watch the live stream and then tune in for the second part of the seminar where I'll offer a commentary on it. Thank you.